Good morning, everyone. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this joint AEI-Brookings conversation on paid family leave. The first ever bipartisan proposal on paid family leave is being introduced by Senator Cassidy and Senator Sinema, and we're very grateful and honored to have them here. My name is Aparna Mathur, and over the last 3 years, I've been working with Sawhill at Brookings on the AEI-Brookings Paid Leave Working Group. The AEI-Brookings Working Group is a group of experts with varying ideological viewpoints. They come from different backgrounds, different perspectives. But we've all come together to work on this significant issue. We have spent several hours over the last few years thinking, debating, and reevaluating what a federal paid leave policy could look like. Our first report came out in 2017 that focused on paid parental leave. And in 2018, last year, we introduced a report that looked more closely at the family and medical leave issue. And you can find copies of the report outside, and Belle will talk a little bit more about that work in a minute. We're continuing this work this year to spur on more research on these areas, but it is thanks to this group that we've been able to provide a balanced and fair perspective on the issue of paid leave. And I think I speak for all of us when I say that when we first began the work, we could not have predicted the momentum that this issue would take on. It's hard to imagine that we're at a point today where we not only have a Democratic bill on paid leave, many Republican bills and proposals on paid leave, but also today the first joint Democratic-Republican proposal on paid leave. This, in my view, is real cause for celebration. Let me briefly talk about why paid leave matters for working families. Paid family and medical leave policies allow families to take time off from work with a certain level of pay to take care of their own illness or to meet caregiving responsibilities at home. And this issue has become more salient over time. As women have entered the labor force in increasing numbers, this has led to a situation where in most households now both parents are working in the labor market, but are also caregivers at home. This chart shows you what's going on with the labor force participation rate for mothers with children under the age of 1, mothers with children under the age of 5. And you can see there's been a big demographic change, a big shift, where more and more women, more and more mothers are in the workforce. And that means that both the father and the mother have joint responsibilities for caregiving at home, and also for being in the workplace and earning incomes. Yet what we have under the current system of unpaid and paid leave is that access to leave is least likely for the most vulnerable workers. Under the 1993 Family and Medical Leave Act, workers are guaranteed unpaid but job-protected leave, subject to meeting certain conditions like working in a firm with more than 50 employees and having tenure with the employer for a certain number of hours per year. Unfortunately, that means that about 40% of the workforce, which is mainly low-wage workers, do not have access to unpaid FMLA job-protected leave. And at the same time, while we are seeing a lot of momentum at the state level when it comes to paid leave provision and also in the private sector, we still have a situation where a lot of low-wage workers simply do not have access to any type of paid or unpaid leave. So this chart shows you that if you're a part-time worker, if you're a low-income, low-wage worker, you're the least likely to have access to any type of paid or unpaid leave. And therefore, we think the need for a federal rethink on this policy is critical. I applaud both Senator Sinema and Senator Cassidy for working together on this extremely vital issue that touches all families across America. We may nitpick on the details of all the proposals that currently exist, but I think we shouldn't lose track of the larger picture, the fact that we're making progress on an issue that has stalled for several years in Congress and is picking up so much steam thanks to efforts like these. So I'm grateful to both of you for being here and look forward to this conversation. I'm going to turn over quickly to Sawhill for a few quick remarks before we have a discussion with the two senators, and then I will introduce the next panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparna, and welcome to all of you. Glad to see so much interest and people standing around the wall. That's terrific, including the senators back there. I would think we could find a seat for you. But I just wanted to really join Aparna in saying what an interesting initiative this has been, the joint Brookings AEI paid leave project. We've been doing it for 3 years now. Many of our colleagues who worked closely with us are here today. I see Angela Rigidi and Elizabeth Jacobs and Harry Holzer and some others that I may have missed or who may be coming later. In any case, we have issued 2 reports now. Aparna said that, but just to reiterate, the first one was on parental leave. We actually were able to come to consensus on what parental leave might look like and had a series of recommendations. We released that report about 2 years ago. And then in the next year of our work, we tackled medical leave and leave for family care purposes. And we had much harder time reaching consensus on those issues. And in the end, we decided we needed more research on those 2 issues particularly. And so we have now commissioned a series of papers, the first drafts of which will be presented at a conference in November. They're being written by some of the most distinguished academics around the country, and we are looking forward to learning more and having a very good discussion at that time. We also have a website that I think is a wonderful central source for information on this issue of paid leave. One thing we've done is to try to track what states are doing. As many of you know, states are very active in this space right now, and we've had a lot of new states who've recently joined the paid leave bandwagon, if you will. And so if you want to try to keep up with what's going on there, we have a sort of state policy tracker and map on the website, lots of blogs and other material, including our reports. Along with Aparna, I want to commend the senators for coming together to work on this. I'm excited to have more conversation with them. And I think I should, in fact, stop now so we can move on to what's much more important, which is hearing about their proposals. So thanks again for being here.
We're going to quickly talk to the 2 senators. Can you tell us a little bit more about what your bill entails? We've seen a lot of new proposals come out. Some talk about a payroll tax, some talk about doing paid leave through Social Security. Could you talk a little bit about why you came together on the child tax credit? And secondly, I know what a lot of people want to know is this bill coming? This is a proposal at this stage, and we are all curious to know, is there a bill that we can expect at some point in the next few weeks?
Well, the exciting news is that it is indeed coming this week.
That's awesome.
So we're almost there. What I'm really excited about with our proposal is that it's the only proposal in either chamber to have bipartisan support. And so while Bill and I have been working on this together for a number of months, we also have been working to garner support from our colleagues. So we expect to see robust support from people in both parties, which makes this a very unique proposal. As we know, many of the proposals that have been introduced in the past have been fairly partisan. And given the divided government we serve in today, legislation which is supported only by members of one party has literally zero chance of making it to the president's desk. So that's what I'm most excited about from a political perspective, is that we were able to find an innovative solution, partial solution to this challenge. And we anticipate that we'll be garnering even more bipartisan support as we move forward.
I'll speak briefly to political and then more broadly to the policy. Let me just thank Kyrsten, because when I heard that she would be interested in collaborating, she and I spoke, and then they considered, and yes, they would. That, to me, breaks a logjam. No one's been able to come together. And I just thank her for being able to, if you will, come out of a comfort zone into a place where we can actually go forward, and not making the perfect the enemy of the good. Because the chief criticism we get is that our proposal is not perfect for that which people want. But it is a good solution. Now let me speak of that solution. Under the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the child tax credit was increased from $1,000 to $2,000. What we allow a parent to do, don't mandate, but she can choose or he can choose, is to pull some of those dollars forward and to take $5,000 upon the birth or the adoption of their child. adoption 6 years of age or less would qualify. We know that the first year of life is the most expensive year of life. We also know that people tend to have their children when they are younger, and so even though they are pulling forward benefits, which I'll describe in a second, if they remain attached to the workforce, wages typically grow, and we think that compensates for those wages which are pulled forward. Now, when I say pull forward, what do I mean? $5,000 upon birth, and instead of the $2,000 tax credit, which would come to them over the next 10 years, they will get $1,500. And so you pull the dollars forward. If the child dies, you don't have to pay it back. It's just washed away. So there'll be a small fiscal note, but still you pull those dollars forward. And we think this is an opportune time to put in such a program because, as I mentioned at the outset, the child tax credit was just increased from $1,000 to $2,000. And so we can take advantage of the increased generosity to allow the parent to choose, not mandate, to choose to take some of those dollars up front.
What's really exciting about the proposal is in addition to providing this immediate benefit to parents, is they can choose how to use those dollars. So as you were mentioning at the beginning of the presentation today, that those who are most likely to not have access to paid leave are wage earners, so folks who are at the lower end of the earning spectrum. And for those individuals, $5,000 in a year means that they might be able to take time off, even if it's unpaid, to stay home with a new baby. Or if they are going back into the workplace, that they would have dollars to pay for appropriate care for their baby. So there's some flexibility in how families use those dollars. What's appealing about this legislation to colleagues in the Senate of both political parties is that it avoids some of the problems that we've seen in the past with other pieces of legislation. There are many folks who are against a proposal that takes from Social Security because Social Security is an earned benefit that folks rely on when it's time to retire. There are also folks who are opposed to increasing a payroll tax. I come from Arizona, and in Arizona you don't increase any taxes, right? You just don't do it. And so those proposals that we've seen from folks, our colleagues, while very well intentioned, haven't been able to garner that bipartisan support because they're touching these issues such as taxes or Social Security that have become lightning rod issues for people of other political parties. By utilizing the child tax credit and making it optional, families can choose to utilize the dollars to which they are entitled anyway, just using them sooner in their child's lifetime. So we're pretty excited about it.
I think it would be helpful if, in addition to describing how it works for most families, which Senator Cassidy just did extremely well, you could also explain, because I'm sure there's some wonky types in this audience that realize that at the bottom of the income scale, people don't get the full child tax credit. It's not fully refundable. And you have a separate proposal for that group. I think it'd be helpful if one of you described that.
Sure.
And I may look over to my staff just to get the echo to make sure I get this right. But if you do not qualify for a refundable portion, you can still draw down that which would be a 3-month replacement for your salary.
That's right.
And this will be deducted from that which you do receive over 15 years. So you'll still receive money on an annual basis. But if you choose, you can have income replacement or money to pay for child care for 3 months. And so we do make that
at 100% wage replacement.
At 100%.
Which I think is important for people to know.
At 100% of what you're earning, you'll have wage replacement for 3 months.
The idea behind this portion of the proposal is to recognize that some wage earners don't earn a high enough income to qualify for the full $2,000 of the child tax credit. And so for those who earn lower wages, they would receive, if they so chose, enough money to pay for that 3-month time period to either stay home or pay for childcare. And they would then, again, the same way as higher wage earners, would receive a slightly smaller benefit over the next 10 years. The idea behind this portion of the proposal is to ensure that folks who earn a lower dollar amount still are able to spend that bonding time with their child if they so choose, or if they work for a company or a business that won't allow them to take even unpaid leave, it means they're not jeopardizing their job.
So we both have high rates of poverty in our state.
That's right.
And you have mentioned that on multiple occasions. And so we consider this the kitchen table issue for those folks who are lower income that does allow that 3-month wage replacement.
That's right.
So
42% of Arizona parents don't have access to any kind of leave, paid or unpaid. And so a proposal like this is an option for that, for those wage earners, which again makes up almost half of the workforce in Arizona.
One question, one concern that people have raised about the use of the CTC is that you are allowing people to pull forward the benefits to that in those initial few months. Yes. But then, what happens in the later years? Because, you have childcare costs that typically tend to also go up or increase over time, and you have expenses. But then if you're pulling forward a lot of that money to the first year and then essentially repaying it in later years, is there any concern about, the family's welfare, the child welfare in future years?
2 points to address that, because that's an important question. First is to remember that the child tax credit just recently moved from $1,000 a year to $2,000 a year. So our proposal, by pulling forward that $5,000, ensures that parents are still getting $1,500 a year, which is more than they were receiving at any time in the past. Right. So they're still seeing a greater benefit than they were prior to this year. The second point is one that Bill mentioned earlier, and that is that for most wage earners, their income increases over time with both increase in age, experience in the workforce. And so as their child gets older, parents are also typically earning more, which allows them to better bear the cost of child rearing. And while child rearing is expensive the whole time, it's most expensive in that first year of life, which is, again, the idea.
And I will build upon that because it's something I learned here that y'all are doing research. One of you mentioned this last time. One of the things we like about our bill is it preserves attachment for the worker to the workforce. We know that if the worker decides to stay at home to be with her child, that she is more likely to go on public assistance and the trajectory of her income remains lesser. If she remains attached to the workforce, the trajectory of her income is higher. And so we do think long term, giving something which is income replacement or allows her to pay for child care and return to work will allow her to remain attached, or him, but I use the feminine for obvious reasons, to remain attached, and therefore statistically, just look at the numbers. As she remains attached to the workforce, her income goes up, and that more than compensates for that pulling forward.
Another note, and there's a lot of data that supports this, that women tend to earn smaller Social Security benefits upon retirement because many women, because of child rearing, have had years in which they were out of the workforce and not earning that income. So this proposal could be used by women who want to return to the workforce to be able to maintain that accrual of income over time, which helps them as they head into retirement as well.
Could I go back to what you said right at the beginning about getting support from your colleagues? We all look at the Democratic side and we see all these people running for president or trying to get the nomination right now, and most of them are co-sponsors of the Family Act. And so I'm sitting here trying to imagine how you're going to get a lot of Democratic support in particular. And on the Republican side, if I may just go down this road a little bit further, I'm also wondering what kind of support you've gotten from the White House. We know that the president, and especially his daughter, is very much in favor of paid leave, but I don't know what kind of discussions you may have had with them and whether they've been helpful.
Well, this may surprise many of you in the room, but the presidential candidates are not my prime target. They're really busy doing other things.
Right.
And the Senate is doing the business of the Senate. And so Bill and I have been reaching out to senators who are wholly focused on the work of the Senate. And while I'm not at liberty yet to name members of the Democratic caucus who are supportive of our legislation, I expect that you'll be pleasantly surprised to see not just the number of folks who will join us, but the breadth of their ideological opinions.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the reason is that for many, many senators, regardless of political affiliation, we hear from our constituents when we go home every weekend. And it turns out that our constituencies, regardless of which state you live in, don't care whether a proposal is a Democratic or Republican proposal. They just want a proposal that's going to help them and their families. And they're agnostic as to the political ideologies attached, which is actually how most Americans are about most things. And so I know that Bill's seeing the same kind of conversations as both of us are talking with members of both parties, that they're interested in finding a solution that not only is it a good solution, but it's possible in the political world that we live in today.
So
I think we all applaud that.
Yeah,
Let me make that clear. I think we're just worried that in order to get anything enacted these days, you do need support in the Senate.
we need 60 votes. We know that. And how Kyrsten opened up, we avoid the polls
That's right.
that are going to peel off a few on either side. And so again, I applaud my Democratic colleague for that. And I just think that we're moving there. The president and his daughter tweeted support of our bill when we first made an announcement. Obviously, that's important. Nothing happens unless the president signs it. And so we think that's good too. But if people decide to make the perfect the enemy of the good, we're not going to go anyplace. But hello to life. You ought to see my marriage. You know what I'm saying? Come on, baby, will you do it? You have this kind of give and take, and sooner or later she gets what she wants.
Which is the secret to happiness.
So I do think if people are willing to accept, hey, we get a benefit. Maybe it's not as expansive as you want, but we don't increase a regressive payroll tax, which is offensive to some, and we don't borrow against future security, which is offensive to others. And we get somewhere in the middle.
Yeah.
What's the business response to this proposal? Have you heard from businesses? I mean, a lot of times with the other proposals you hear about, this is not something that businesses are keen to have. Is it coming down as a mandate? Is this going to lead to crowd out? What's the business reaction you expect or you've seen or heard from?
Well, I've been talking about this with business leaders and child and family advocates at home in Arizona, certainly during the August work period. And the response has been pretty uniformly supportive because it is not a mandate.
Yeah.
It does not add any additional cost to a business. And especially for small business owners, which make up 98% of Arizona's economy, this provides an opportunity for them to keep workers engaged in the system so they don't have moms and dads who have to quit or leave when they have a child or adopt a child. It allows them to stay connected to the company, and it does so without adding a benefit or a burden, which, of course, as we know, most small businesses cannot afford in today's economy.
Yeah, so similarly, we've heard really positive feedback from smaller businesses, not a mandate. You mentioned the word crowd out. One thing I'll point out, some of the larger businesses, let me start over. Some states have put in programs like this already, financed by payroll taxes. Yeah. And what you have found, if California puts in a paid family leave policy, that Google just subtracts the amount of money they are currently paying to their employee, and they just, okay, this is what the state's giving you, we're going to subtract what you're giving you, and we'll just make up the difference. Yeah. So it's really a subsidy to Google for the state to do this. And Deloitte and Touche and the rest. Now, by the way, from the stats that you put up there, Aparna, it is the higher income, think Google engineers, that are doing quite well under the current system. That's not what we're looking. We're looking at that family which is struggling to make ends meet, who doesn't have something, as you see on that graph right there, in which they have paid family leave, even if it is by another name.
That's right.
And so ours inherently is not a crowd out situation because it's not a mandate. And it is more geared towards those folks who probably don't work for such a company as are currently given benefits.
Well, and that's important to note. If you work for a company that already provides 12 weeks of paid leave, you don't likely have much interest in this proposal because you're receiving a benefit through your employer that exceeds the value of this proposal. This proposal is designed for the vast majority of Americans who don't work at a company that provides a benefit such as that, which, again, in Arizona, is most of the workforce.
I think as you both have emphasized, this doesn't raise taxes, and that makes it much more politically viable. But let me ask, there's, I assume, some small costs because of the pulling of the benefits forward. Has anybody done a scoring on the cost of this yet?
It hasn't, because we haven't introduced it.
Uh-huh.
So my guess is that the score would be pretty minimal, because while you're pulling the benefits forward and they're being deducted from a future tax credit, it is interest-free.
Right,
So it's
right.
important to note that parents aren't taking a ding for getting these dollars sooner. But we expect that the cost will be fairly minimal.
That's what I'd assume, but
Yeah.
it'd be good to have that number because that's an advantage of the plan.
That's right.
And
To some
again,
people anyway.
building upon what you taught us last time, it is possible that this will be a positive for the federal fisc
right.
because as people remain attached to the workforce, they tend to pay more payroll taxes
Yep.
because their income is rising. The company is more productive because that which they've invested in training is not lost, but it's preserved. And so therefore the company is more productive, et cetera. So it is possible that we end up doing something positive.
Although I don't think that your scorers will go for looking at those kind of dynamic effects.
What we need is a couple of good
Yeah.
think tanks to put out such a compelling case that they have no other.
I wonder which
maybe
ones could
publish a
do it. One final question before we turn to the
We do have a
audience.
costing
Yeah,
tool here at
calculator,
AEI, yes.
Just one quick question. Do you view this proposal as a starting point? I'm sure a lot of people are wondering, is this only going to remain focused on parental leave? Are we going to open up to other, other users, family and medical leave? Are there other ways to do that? So I understand that you're viewing this as, it's a basic starting point. That's where we need to be. This is the only way to get the two parties to talk to each other and move forward. Do you anticipate that the proposal would grow bigger, that you would include other types of leave in it? Are there other thoughts about how that could happen?
Well, my experience, I'm now in my 7th year serving here in Washington, D.C., and was privileged enough to serve in my state legislature prior to coming to Washington. And my experience has been that I am most successful when I choose proposals to work on that are manageable and that are not particularly complex. The more complex and difficult a proposal gets, the easier it is for individuals to say no. And so that's certainly been my MO over the last 16 years, is to find chunks that we can be successful with, and then after achieving that success, building on it to find the next layer or the next step of success.
Now, I think it really is up to the viewer to decide. You could say, my gosh, this addresses the issue of paid family leave, which is most common, which is that of the birth of a child. There are other issues which are important, but they're substantially less common. Or you could say, well, we've solved one problem, let's work on another. I don't think our door is shut.
Right.
But I do applaud our staffs and our offices for coming up with a creative way in a current context without raising taxes to provide an option for a family for their well-being.
That's right.
If we can come up with something similar for elder care, hey, I'm open to it.
Yeah.
But I would want it to meet the same criteria that we've
That's
worked
right.
on so far.
That's right.
That's excellent. Okay, we have time for a few quick questions. We can start here. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much for this. Jane Addams from Bread for the World. Senator Cassidy, you said your bill isn't for high-income workers, but in the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, the child tax credit phase-out rate was raised to families that make $400,000. So I'm assuming under your proposal, those families that are high-income earners could take the $5,000 credit based on their birth, whereas low-income families, very poor families who don't receive the full refundability of the child tax credit only get about $500 in a CTC. So they would take the 3 months of full 100% paid parental leave, which I think is great, but then they wouldn't really even earn a child tax credit potentially for the next 15 years.
No, there would still be a couple things.
Yeah.
One, of course, if you're making $400,000 a year, you could still pull it down.
It's just unlikely.
Yeah, it's just less important to you. On the other hand, that family which is lower income does get complete income replacement for 3 months, and they continue to get a child tax credit. They pay back over 15 years, and we stretch it from 10 to 15 to, my staff was texting me to make sure I mentioned that. So, Jane, you allow me to kind of get my staff off my back.
I'll chat with them later.
So we stretch it out so that we preserve that they continue to receive income on an ongoing basis.
And so the impact on their annual income is lesser. So they still get the benefit of the 3 months, but the quote payback, so to speak, which again isn't really a payback, it's just a reduced credit in the future, is minimized so that it's less impactful to their lives. Because of course, as we all know, $500 means something different to a minimum wage worker than it does to a family that's earning $200,000 a year.
Great, next question. Okay, Angela, and then Chris, and then.
Hi, Angela Rashidi, American Enterprise Institute. So as you know, the Family Medical Leave Act offers job protection for workers who have a new child, but a lot of low-income workers do not get access to the FMLA and don't have that job protection. So I guess my question is, are you concerned that without that job protection, low-income workers may not benefit from the program that you're talking about?
This is an important question, and that's why, as I mentioned earlier, 42% of Arizona adults do not qualify for the FMLA because they work for small businesses and the law does not apply to them. So for those families, they could still take advantage of our legislation and would most likely use it as payment of childcare so that they can go back to work and preserve their job status. For those who work for companies where FMLA does apply, they would have more flexibility in choosing whether to use it as wage replacement while they stay home or to use it for childcare if they choose to go back to work quickly. So that was one of the reasons that we ensured that those dollars could be used as the parents chose, so as to protect the right of those individuals who need to go back to work to be able to do so.
Christos?
Good morning. Thank you both so much for being here. And great to see Arizona. I'm an Arizona native, so great to see this. My question is a little bit more on the scoring side. And by now, there's a lot of empirical evidence about the returns to early childhood and how important it is for parents to spend time with their children. And so as you go through the dynamic scoring and looking at the payoffs over the long run, one question is, by allowing parents to actually spend that one-on-one time with their children and not drop out of the labor force, it can have very large impacts on human capital accumulation later in life. Do you have quantitative estimates that you've built in to account for those other net benefits that this bill seems to be providing for?
We don't,
Yeah, no.
we don't have quantitative estimates, but hopefully from your lips to CBO's ears.
Yeah.
Now, as a physician, I know that if the mother stays home and breastfeeds, the health of the baby and the health of the mother is benefited. For example, the mother's more likely to lose weight postpartally. And so therefore, she's less at risk for metabolic syndrome issues such as diabetes and hypertension. I'm taking this out second or third order, but you look at the medical literature, and that's absolutely in the medical literature. So hopefully the CBO will look at that second and third order. But we do think, even if they do not, that the score will be de minimis, just because, well, yeah, you're giving up some interest rates, and yeah, you're going to have a couple kids that die, unfortunately, in the first 10 years of life. But really, relative to the whole scheme of things, we don't think that will be that much.
Yeah. I will say, of all the concerns around this legislation, the CBO score is not one of my concerns. I feel good about it. I think that we've been spending more of our time thinking about how do we get colleagues on both sides of the aisle to understand that an innovative proposal is, we think, more realistic than some of the other proposals that have been introduced, which are more aspirational.
Good morning. I'm Meredith Singer with IBM. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for describing your proposal to us. My question is for you, Senator Cassidy, given that you're also chairing the Senate Finance Working Group on paid family and medical leave. Do you expect that group to be championing this proposal, or is the group also looking at broader forms of paid family and medical leave? And when do you think we may see something broader out of that group? Thank you.
So Maggie Hassan is my co-chair. She is a former governor, an incredibly reasonable person. I'm not presuming that she is going to agree to that which we propose, but she is a woman who is intellectually curious, will want to hear all the proposals, and I think as much as anything, you're just trying to bring to light that which is important to the issue. I don't have to persuade her, she'll come to her own conclusion. But I also do think that as we bring more facts to life, for example, I learned from a similar hearing way back when that Google does generously provide benefits, but they do subtract from them whatever a state in turn provides. That's an important thing to know. And so I'm looking at this hearing, and we are planning one coming up, not to persuade Maggie or anyone else, but rather to illuminate.
I think we have time for one very quick question at the back, and that's the last one.
Hi, Jessica Mason with the National Partnership for Women and Families. Thank you so much for coming today. We're looking forward to seeing the details of the bill, so these may or may not be questions you can answer right now, but I think we've already heard today that the bill provides no additional provision for time beyond what the FMLA provides, and so people not covered by FMLA will, instead of using this as paid leave, quote unquote, will use it as a child care payment. And I was curious also about the timing. Of course, IRS tax refunds tend to come in February, March, April, May, sort of whenever you file your taxes and IRS is able to get through it. And so that means someone who, in principle, has a child in January may not see that CTC until more than a year later, depending on sort of how tax filing season goes. And so I was wondering if there's a provision in the bill to actually time those benefits, because this, of course, is an important aspect of the state program, so people get that wage replacement when they're actually out of work.
I'll answer the first part of your question, and that is the idea that folks who are not protected by FMLA have less choice of how to spend the dollars if they choose to use this benefit. That is accurate. However, it was important for us in the drafting process to find potential solutions to the challenge of family medical leave without creating mandates or changing existing laws, because that's, of course, when you butt up against opposition, and then you're not able to actually pass the legislation and implement it. So this was our attempt to provide something completely voluntary that does not create any new burdens on the employers in our country. The second part of the question is pretty simple, is that you pull down the benefit if you were to choose to use it at the time of the birth.
Yes. And I'll also say, for those who say, well, wait a second, you're not going far enough by also addressing the vulnerability of somebody who might not be able to use the benefit to stay home, I will say once more, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, imagine that. Someone who's currently not getting a benefit now gets a benefit. And maybe she can stay at home and breastfeed, or maybe she decides to return to work instead of leaving work, as is often the case now. What an incredible advance. But if we say it's not everything we want, therefore we will not accept that which we have, I think we're going to be where we've been for the last decade, hoping that we can get something done, but somehow it never working out. And that, I think, is our common ground.
Yep, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much to both of you for being here and for all your work on this issue. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Excellent conversation. Thank you so much. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Belle.
Thank you. Nice to see you, Senator.
Okay. We'll be moving to our panel in just a couple of minutes. I'm going to invite them on stage.
Just going to grab my coffee.
Yeah, sure.
This question about timing, I was thinking about it last night, too. And
Let me just do bios and then
All right.
let me just do.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, so let's quickly introduce our next panel. I know we have a ton of questions. I think that conversation raised a lot more than maybe we wanted answered. So we have on the panel now, Harry Holzer is the John Lafarge Professor of Public Policy at Georgetown University and an Institute Fellow at the American Institutes for Research. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a research affiliate at the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, an affiliate scholar with the Urban Institute, and an affiliate of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. Elizabeth Jacobs is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, where she focuses on issues related to family, economic security, and mobility. Her previous roles include founding senior director at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, fellow at the Brookings Institution, and senior policy advisor with the U.S. Senate Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions, and the U.S. Joint Economic Committee. And finally, we have Angela Rashidi, is a research fellow in poverty studies at AEI, where she studies poverty and the effects of federal safety net programs on low-income people in America. She's an expert in support programs for low-income families, including the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families and the SNAP program. So welcome to all of you. And we're just going to begin with your general reactions to the proposal. What questions you had, did those get answered? What should we be focusing on this first, sort of the bipartisan first bill on paid leave? Angela, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So general reaction. Well, first, I'd like to say I really like this bill. I mean, that's kind of my overall general reaction. I think there's a couple things we know. I mean, we know that some parents face constraints when it comes to making decisions about returning to work out of economic necessity or staying home to care for a new child. And we also know that when they face those constraints, research tells us that there are negative consequences to that for the health and well-being of generally the mother and also the child, as well as just to the economy as a whole. So we know those things. I generally am a person who is skeptical of federal programs to try to solve problems like I just laid out. I generally support limited government. I don't necessarily think the federal government has all of the answers, but I do think that there can be a role for government policy when certain needs are not being met. And I think the data that Aparna showed earlier is that there are some needs that are not being met. So with those two things in mind, there's kind of three principles that I think about in any bill when it comes to paid parental leave would need to satisfy. One is that it is well-targeted, kind of that issue of not crowding out not only employer benefits, but also crowding out things like personal savings, help from family and friends, like all the other things that families have access to that doesn't necessarily need government intervention. The second is, so well-targeted, the second is limited in scope. There's a body of research that suggests that when benefits like this are too generous, it actually harms mothers in particular in terms of their labor force attachment. The third is, so limited in scope, the third is fiscally or financially viable and sustainable. And so when you think of those three things together, the reason I like this bill is because I think it checks all of those boxes. It's well-targeted. I like to think of it as kind of quasi-voluntary. Only the people who really need it are going to take advantage of it. It is limited in scope in terms of it provides $5,000 in benefits or 12 weeks, so we don't have to be concerned about those negative effects on long-term labor force attachment. And the third is that it is fiscally viable and sustainable because it's repurposing existing money. So from that sense, I do really like the bill because I think it checks those three boxes. There's a few concerns I have about the financing mechanism using the child tax credit, but maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Okay. Harry?
So I think this is a pretty major step forward on this issue. It's very important. The issue of paid family leave is very important for all the majority of workers right now, especially lower to middle income workers who don't get anything right now. It's very important for something to be done at the federal level because most states, in fact, are not going to do anything except for some of the bluer states right now that are moving forward. And again, any time that there's a bipartisan anything in the federal government right now that moves something in the right direction, that's a good thing. And by the way, I much, much prefer this mechanism to borrowing against Social Security, which is what a lot of other Republicans have proposed on this issue. So overall, I see this as a pretty major net positive. I do have a few concerns. And by the way, whether it does garner this political support in the future, bipartisan, maybe it will, maybe it won't. We can talk about that a little later. I do have a few concerns. Number one, Bell raised the issue of budget neutrality. It's not budget neutral, and I don't know if the costs will be. I mean, Senator Sinema said, well, nobody's going to have to pay interest. Well, if the federal government borrows more, it does have to pay interest, in fact. That does add to the federal deficit. A dollar paid back 10 years from now is worth much less than a dollar taken today. So, and again, there might be an offset in terms of higher women's labor force participation. But again, we need to see some numbers on that, even speculatively, what that might be. Secondly, the whole thing is predicated on the assumption that workers 5 to 10 years from now will be in better shape in terms of their earnings, and therefore you're enabling them to borrow against those future savings, but at a time when they need it more rather than less. That's not always going to be true. I mean, some of these parents are going to be unemployed in the future. Some of them will maybe be permanently displaced by automation or some other force. They might well be worse off, especially if they're single parents in the future. What if they have 3 kids and they owe back $1,500? Now, you could say, well, but they got an extra, they got a $2,000 credit for each kid, but still, taking away $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 in the future for people who are in a more precarious situation may not be a better thing. And then it is considerably less generous for a lot of people than the state plans out there. If you crunch the numbers really quickly, take someone earning $40,000 a year, which puts them sort of in a sort of lower middle class kind of situation. Let's say, so the first 3 months, they would be foregoing $10,000 of earnings at a 75 or 80% replacement rate. They'd be getting $7,000 or $8,000 in that time period. They're worse off under this plan, and lots of other folks are too. So what you hear me inching towards is that I much prefer some version of the state plans. And by the way, we've all been in these discussions for a few years. I am often one of the progressives who argues against the most generous, not because I think it'll encourage the women to stay out. I worry about the costs imposed on employers, for instance. But taking all these concerns, I think the social insurance model is just a much better way to do this. And you're talking about everybody's payroll tax going up, usually by a very small amount, usually well under a percentage point. And by the way, unlike what Senator Cassidy said, you can make the surcharge more progressive. You can set up, and some places are doing that, setting up a tax that does depend on. So it's not automatically, and that, you're really spreading out the pain much more evenly and not imposing potential future costs on people when they might need it. So I much prefer that model. So then if you ask the question, well, why not? Why is that so clearly off the table? I'm going to be very blunt about this. We live in an era of federal fiscal insanity, federal fiscal madness, where you're not ever allowed to consider a tax increase. It doesn't matter how sensible the public good is. It doesn't matter how popular those public goods are with the public. It doesn't even matter how underfunded many of those public goods. We're not allowed to even talk about a tax increase. And again, Senator Sinema said in my state, even for a Democratic senator, it's off the table. I think that's very unfortunate. So in that kind of a world, in a world where we live with this degree of fiscal madness, where to me the most sensible models are off the table, you're looking at these sort of third and fourth best alternatives, and among those other alternatives, this one looks pretty good.
So I would echo a lot of what Harry just said, and rather than repeating it, I'll say a couple additional things. The first is that I went back to the AEI-Brookings working group to our original report, because one of the things we did in that report was put out a set of principles that we felt we had bipartisan, kind of cross-ideological consensus around what a paid leave proposal should have in it. And I matched up this policy against those. And the first was, is it gender neutral? So yes, this policy is gender neutral. any parent can take it. Is it budget neutral? To echo Harry's point, the senators both spoke about it as though it is budget neutral. I think that's a bigger question than what they've put out there. And I would say on that point, I'm not convinced actually that this is a proposal that wealthier families wouldn't want to take advantage of, because why wouldn't you want $5,000 to invest yourself rather than letting the government hold on to it and getting it over time, particularly if you're confident that the CTC that you get over the coming years isn't particularly important to you in the grand scheme of your family income. So I think it's probably substantially less budget neutral than it's being sold as. And then the third point, we suggested targeted, progressive, and adequate benefits. I added in the adequate, but I think that was kind of without saying. And I think there's a big question here as to exactly how this particular proposal hits all three of those. Is it targeted? Not really, based on what I just said. Is it progressive? Maybe, although it's not totally clear to me exactly how they handle low earners based on the refundable credit and the kind of different payment scheme over time. And is it adequate? I think it's almost certainly not adequate for people in the bottom half of the distribution. We suggested that paid leave needed to be job protected, and that's based on lots of research suggesting that job protection is incredibly important for people in the bottom half of the income distribution in order to use that leave. That comes from research in the States and research from other countries that have paid leave. Job protection is really critical if you want the people who don't currently take leave or have access to leave. It's really important to getting them to take up benefits, particularly if the benefits aren't super generous, which in this country, they're just not going to be, right? We can do better, but we still need to be realistic, I think. And then the last piece, there were pieces in all of this that we felt like there were still open research questions, even in the existing state-based programs, about key questions that we didn't quite know enough about. And there's obviously, I mean, this isn't a bill yet, so there's no evaluation component, but I would say that a lot of the arguments for it are relying on what we know about paid leave that comes from very different policy models at very different levels at very different timing. And so applying what's really a growing body of research on what paid leave can do, both in terms of the health benefits, but also the economic benefits for families and for the country, it's not really an apples to apples comparison. So I'm very nervous about the idea of saying that this is a labor force participation, labor force attachment inducing bill, because it's not clear to me actually that it is. We really have no research. So all of that said, I actually think that this is an interesting and potentially positive development if we think of it as part of a different debate. Like, take it out of the debate over how we do paid family medical leave in this country and put it into the debate over how should we make the child tax credit more useful to families. And then I think it's a different policy question, and it potentially becomes a really interesting and important proposal. And then you'd match it up against things like there are proposals for boosting the child tax credit for young families, which this kind of fits into, although this is revenue neutral in that it's not additional money, it's just shifting the money. But you could kind of compare it there, or you could compare it to things like the Bennett-Brown bill on a universal child allowance. It's a different policy conversation. It's obviously related. We can't solve all of the many, many, many problems and pressures on particularly families in the bottom half of the income distribution with one bucket of policies. And I think this one has kind of been pitched and thrown into the wrong bucket.
That last point is a really interesting one to me. I had thought about this a little bit as well. Some of us have earlier proposed that we reform the EITC in a way, I even had a proposal like this myself, in which we give more generous benefits to families with very young children and less generous to those with older children who are more likely to be in school and so forth. And so your thoughts about that, I think, are very creative. I want to go to an issue, though, that I think you also brought up, Elizabeth, and that is, wouldn't wealthy families pull this forward too? And here's what I started thinking about. There don't seem to be any constraints on pulling the money forward for any purpose as long as you just had a child. That's the only condition. So, I'm a family with $250,000, whatever. I've just had a second baby or whatever, and I need money to buy a car, and if I buy it, or a house, And if I buy it the usual way, I'm going to have to pay the going interest rate. Why wouldn't I say, hey, here's an interest-free loan from the government? Nobody's going to come around and say, are you spending that on childcare? Are you spending that to stay home? Because as far as I can tell, that's not in the bill. So there could begin to be a lot of use of this for purposes it wasn't really intended for. And now maybe this is a nitpicky point that could be fixed in an actual bill, but I think it's worth talking about. And I think a lot about what the lessons we've learned from behavioral science, which is that people often are myopic and think about what they do with Social Security benefits. They often take them at 62 or 65 when they'd be much better off to wait until they were 70 unless they think they're going to die prematurely. And yet many people, most people don't wait. And I worry a little bit that this will encourage, especially lower middle income families or families who are financially stressed for one reason or another, to take the money up front and be in trouble down the road. And we already have problems with student loans and credit card debt and so forth. So sorry to go on about that, but I think it's an interesting aspect of any bill that allows you to borrow interest-free.
That is interesting, and I guess even currently the CTC, there are no conditions on how you use the refundable portion of the CTC or if you get tax savings. I mean, it doesn't really tell you that the money has to go to a specific purpose. And that's why I've always sort of looked at the child independent care credit and said, well, at least we know where the money is being used. That specifically is for childcare expenses. Right. And so why not try to modify that? Why not make that refundable? But that's an interesting point you raised, right? Like, what does the CTC do? Is that money, every family who has a child basically gets the money, right. Irrespective of how you use the money.
I want to make 2 points based on Belle's point. The first one is the delivery mechanism really matters and the timing of delivery. And I think Senator Sinema answered, there was a question out there on exactly this point of kind of when does the money show up and does it show up at the right time? And I still don't understand, based on my interactions with the IRS, like exactly how this money would show up at the time that families need it. And the families that need it most are the poorer families, right? Low-income families don't, it's not like, it's great to have a windfall at the end of the year, but if this is really about actually supporting new parents, then the windfall at the end of the year isn't doing what this is meant to do. Now, that's part of why I would put this in a separate bucket, because maybe a windfall at the end of the year isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's certainly not support for new parents. Whereas wealthier families who can pull forward this credit, like that, they're not as dependent on the money at a given point in time because they have substantially more stability over time and more to draw on from just basic household balance sheets. Go ahead.
So Belle actually said 2 things. One, she talked about the progressivity of it, or lack of progressivity in some sense, with these high-income families taking this money. I think that's true. It wouldn't be a huge stretch to say it phases out above a certain level of income. Now, of course, as soon as you do that, it becomes a lot less popular with one of the political parties, because anything that redistributes in some sense is opposed by most Republicans, frankly. So, but I think that would be a sensible thing to do to limit the cost of this. Now, the other issue, though, Belle's right. It is a form of dissavings, borrowing against anticipated future income flows. To take it up front is like a negative form of savings. And again, for some people, and of course it depends how you do that, like taking out of Social Security is completely crazy because the money, people really need that money at that point in life. The senators believe people are have stronger earnings flows in later years when they're pushing this back. That, again, will be true for some but not all. So I do share that concern. But again, I just think, among the different proposals, how much $500 per year, and for whom it's probably better than the other proposals based on some form of dissavings, although again, that's a pretty low bar.
On the just savings point
Yeah.
too, I would just say there's lots of literature, and this goes back to my earlier point of kind of think about this in the child tax credit policy bucket as opposed to the family leave bucket. There's lots of really good literature at this point telling us how important the child tax credit has been for poverty reduction amongst children. And there's lots of good literature suggesting what it could look like and how powerful it could be if we expanded it in different ways. And I worry, I take Senator Sinema's point earlier today. It's important, the fact that the credit was bumped up to $2,000 from $1,000, and this would leave people in the middle, so people would still be getting more than they would have gotten in the past. There is some logic behind that, and I appreciate that point, but I also am wary, given how strong the empirical evidence is for how important the CTC has been for families, and that because of this myopia, which is completely rational and probably the right thing to do if you think about yourself as a very poor new parent who has the opportunity to actually pull down some money and support your kid, like I would obviously do that, even though I know that it's probably the wrong long-term decision. That we don't know what the consequences would be, but everything from the empirical literature we know to date suggests that they would not be good. And those spillover effects in terms of the long-term effects on kids and the economy and all of the kind of sales points for effective paid leave policy in turn kind of unravel over time if you're taking water out of one bucket to pour it into another.
I have two quick design questions. Elizabeth, you raised a very interesting, so I started thinking about the gender neutrality issue. When we talked about gender neutrality in our proposal, we assume that both parents have access to leave and a certain wage replacement rate. Whereas what's happening in this proposal is that the family gets a certain amount of the CTC, but it's not clear that both parents will need to take, so it's one source of funding, essentially. It's not really telling families that from your job you will get a certain wage replacement. It's really saying that the family is getting a certain pool of money, and both parents are free to take that leave, but it's not really gender neutral in the way we traditionally think about gender neutrality. So I don't know if you have thoughts on that. And Angela, on the job protection issue, which is really key, do you think this proposal goes far enough in terms of improving that access to low-wage workers, ensuring that they will feel comfortable taking the CTC, and they do mention the flexibility that you can still work and take the leave and take the money, but how do you see it playing out?
Yeah, just a couple points to the previous points as well. One, I don't necessarily think this is gender neutral, but I also don't think the social insurance models that are out there are gender neutral either, for a lot of different reasons. So I think we're kind of fooling ourselves if we think that that is also gender neutral. I think moms are going to take leave, and I think dads are less likely to take leave. I think that's just being practical. On another point is that this discussion, though, about wealthier families accessing it, all of that, and they won't use it for what it's intended to be used for, I think we can always come up with scenarios of how it's not going to be used as intended. Again, the same arguments can be made for the social insurance model. And the social insurance model that we've talked about is universal, so it can go to anybody, no matter what income you have. So I don't really think that's a good, necessarily, criticism of this proposal. The job protection is one area. So all those things, I really like the bill from that perspective. The job protection is one area that I'm a little bit concerned about, because I think that much of the research that we base our support for paid leave on is the fact that there's a parent that's at home bonding with the child. So if you don't have that job protection, I can appreciate what Senator Sinema said about you can use that for childcare, but it misses that point that it's about having a parent home with the child to care for the child. So I wish there was a way to add job protection, maybe, and Senator Sinema said they didn't want to reform any existing laws, but I wish there was a way to kind of take a look at FMLA in the same effort.
So I could quibble with some of the things you said, and I think some of the proposals do have more pressure to make sure the money is being used for the purpose, and some of them do phase out, the benefits do phase out by income. So, but I want to focus on the job protection issue, because I think that's really, really critical. And I didn't fully understand, what Senator Sinema said, clarified that there is no job protection in the bill. And I think that's going to make it much harder to get Democratic support, frankly. I think that's just going to be viewed as one of those things. Now, again, unless you're in the world of something always beats nothing, and if you believe there's no chance down the road to get a bill with job protection closer to the social insurance model, people might make that leap. But I think it's really hard, and I think it will deny. The whole point of this is to have moms at home with their kids. It will, for a lot of folks, will have employers who don't want to see their employee disappear for 3 months and will not preserve those jobs. And I just think that's such a key plank for any of these proposals. So it's hard for me to see a lot of Democrats basically signing on. On the other hand, it's hard for me to see a lot of Republicans signing on to an alternative bill that does provide it. That's just going to be one of those big sticking points where the two parties are really far apart, unfortunately.
Just picking up on your points about the political support from Democrats, unless we think the House is going to flip to the Republicans again, it's really hard for me to imagine them liking this approach. And if they don't like it, and it's basically a finance bill, I don't know where it goes. And so unless it captures people's attention, people like us, intellectually, so to speak, and begins to get more momentum, it seems to me like it is very creative and interesting, and we can all commend them for having worked together. But I just really wonder if it's politically viable. So any more comments about that?
Well, I just want to maybe throw back a question to my friends and colleagues here. So to what Senator Cassidy said about the perfect being the enemy of the good. So I also don't think it's politically viable in the near future, or even the long-term future, that the Senate or Congress would support a payroll tax increase. Mm-hmm. So that somewhat takes that off the table. So is this kind of a proposal, is it a viable option because it is a compromise because the alternative is nothing?
Yeah.
I think that's correct.
Right argument.
I think that's the right
I think that's correct, and it all depends on what people's expectations are on each side of the aisle for the future configurations. If the Democrats think they have a chance of getting control of the Senate and the House and the presidency, now they still need 60 votes on this, although the tax actually might come under budget rules. You might only need 50 on it. So that might change that, but everybody's going to be thinking, is there any chance we can do better if we hold out? And on the other hand, if they believe they can't, and if you believe the Republicans have a bit of a lock on the Senate, which may or may not turn out to be true, depending on what happens in 2020, then I think Angela's argument does have a little more force. Although, again, I still think it's hard for Democrats to sign on the bill with no job protection.
Democrats are going to say, just to pick up on your phraseology here or on Senator Cassidy's, they're going to say this is a case where the good might be the enemy of something much better.
And I would say, I mean, I'm a researcher by training. I'm not a political strategist, so I don't actually know. But I would say, and again, I keep on saying this because I think the right bucket to think about this is in child tax credit reform and kind of how we deal with that policy as opposed to paid leave. And I think I can imagine a world where the researcher in me wants to see this versus a young child tax credit and see a randomized experiment to see what actually happens and whether it matters, right? Like, which isn't how politics happen. That's just my research mind working. But I can see that seems to be the right, like, which policy is the right one, and one of them is more progressive and more expensive, and the other one is essentially borrowing from later to boost young families' financial status when they have new children, or ideally that's the idea. And I can see kind of those two things being in competition and having a debate between those two. It's very difficult for me to imagine, given all of the questions, both in terms of administrating and also the impact of this bill, along with the job protection and the other pieces that we've talked about. It's very difficult for me to imagine this becoming kind of a counterpoint in any meaningful way to some of the other proposals that are out there.
I think it's fair to point out that they don't view it as sort of a counterpoint to, let's say, the Family Act. I think the point is there's an existing structure for doing the CTC. All we're letting people do is sort of borrow forward. Maybe that's a simpler step to get paid leave. Just like we had the employer tax credits come in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Technically, that's a paid leave bill. You can take it for all of the reasons we use in the FMLA. And I view this as sort of, again, a smaller step where you improve access to a few more people. Yes, it's not ideal. Yes, it's not, going and achieving all the purposes that the FMLA does. But, I can see strongly, I think, on the right, Republicans sort of coalescing around these kinds of ideas more than, let's say, for a payroll tax or something.
I do think Elizabeth's right, that if it's framed more as a how do we reform or make better the child tax credit that better serves the needs of families, I think that does kind of change the way you think about it. And in all practicality, if we're concerned about new parents having resources in their household after the birth or adoption of a child, this might be the way to do it, because the likelihood of getting a social insurance system is not high. And so this may be the way to go, and maybe it is just a way of framing it in a different way.
You can do, you could presumably engage in this debate and similarly spend the vast majority of your time working to pass the Family Act. Like, I think you can actually separate the two out, and maybe people can walk and chew gum at the same time, but I don't want this to be a distraction from the social insurance, the progress towards the social insurance-based models. And I say that because all of the states that have existing and so far very successful paid leave models that are much more expansive than this as well, both in terms of generally generosity, but also they cover not only parental leave, but also caregiving leave and one's own medical leave, which I think we think of parental leave as the most important type of leave that people need to take, and it's certainly important, but the most common leave is actually own medical leave. It's not parental leave. So this idea that from a kind of leave taking and moving in and out of the labor force due to care issues, whether they're for yourself or someone else, parental leave is sort of the happiest one, because everyone's very excited and wants to support people when they have a new baby. It's much more difficult to talk about what you need to do when you have a herniated disc. That's just less, it's less fun. But these programs in the states are working, and many of these states also have child tax credits, and they chose to do paid leave and have their paid leave conversation around figuring out how to build on, in many cases, their temporary disability insurance model and build on a social insurance-based model, because they saw that working and they saw that serving the purposes it needed to. They didn't choose the child tax credit route, but they still have CTCs, right? So you can do both of these.
But to be fair, those are all very blue states, and we see no evidence at all of a red state, even a purple state going that. Okay, which but I just think we have to be honest about the political opposition.
Is New Hampshire doing it through a payroll tax?
New Hampshire's
is the opt-in, or?
They're still figuring it out.
Yeah, they're still figuring it out.
Yes, there's a live debate, and I throw out New Hampshire because it is a purple to
but that raises
red
an interesting
state that is,
question.
in
Like,
fact,
if you got a federal CTC kind of paid leave bill, and the interaction with does it even affect the interaction with the state programs? It's probably less worrying than if you got like a new payroll tax at the federal level, and then worry about, well, how does this fit into what the state's already doing? I think those interactions would be interesting to figure out too.
We probably should turn to the audience. I want to put one more issue on the table. You don't have to answer it now, but just to get it out there in case anybody wants to address it, and then we'll go to the audience. I've done a lot of work on fertility and on parenting, and I've become convinced that, and I think the research suggests, it's better to have children when you're more mature. And none of us likes the idea of teenage pregnancy and childbearing, for example, for sort of obvious reasons. And it's better if you found a stable partner and you're mature enough and you're really ready to take on the most important responsibility any of us ever takes on, which is to have a child. So my question in that context, if anybody wants to take it on, is do we think this might encourage people to have children earlier and even before they're in a stable situation, or do we not worry about that because it's just not important enough to have that effect? But maybe we want to go to the
Can I actually?
Yeah,
I
you
have
can do
this, only because it lets me make a different point that's related, and I think.
So while people are thinking of the questions.
Yeah, exactly. You can think of your questions while I'm talking. I don't think it'll actually matter because I don't think that people will know and make fertility decisions based on this. And that's one of my other issues with the policy is I have a very difficult time understanding how, particularly for people who aren't thinking about their tax strategy all year, how they know about this and actually get the money in time. And that gets back to my earlier point about kind of the administration of this policy and how the senators, I think they're right in saying choosing something simple and relatively kind of easy to wrap one's mind around is good political strategy. That makes sense. But on the other hand, I think this policy from an administrative perspective is far more complicated than they make it out to be, both in terms of administration and even like the math. So I don't think that anyone's going to be making fertility decisions because the fact that the three of us had an email thread last night where we were trying to actually figure out exactly what this would mean for people who got a refundable credit and how they would figure out, they talk about a 3-month 100% wage replacement, but your taxes are based on annual income, so how do you calculate what those 3 months of wages are, particularly for this group that's probably very unstable. My point really is just that I think fertility decisions are like the last thing that we need to worry about in terms of what this policy might affect because it's so opaque in terms of understanding like what it would do as far as people's decision making and when they'd have it.
That's probably right. I think the economic research suggests the bigger the decision, the smaller the impact tax. So, household arrangements are susceptible to tax policy. My guess is that for fertility and for some populations be much smaller. Although I will say, having made the opposite mistake of Belle's, I had twins when I was in my 40s, and having just sent them off to college, I can say that can cut both ways if you're really concerned about that.
But if only you'd had $5,000.
That would have made it That would have made it
the make or
snap.
break a decision. Okay, let's turn to questions from the audience. Who's gonna be
Comments?
brave enough to go
What do you
first?
all think?
Yes, we have.
Thank you. I was hoping, I'm sorry, and thank you so much for giving this. This is wonderful, and it was, I think, great to hear the senators speak and then to have the panel discussion. I'm unaffiliated, so I won't introduce myself, but I was hoping there would be some kind of consideration for single-parent households that do exist, even in the first year of having a child. And I guess just maybe to leave it open and see what the panel any takes on that subject. Thanks.
Well, the single-parent households would likely be the lower-income households, so those are the households that we're talking about when we got into the discussion about how does the refundable portion work. And for me personally, and I think my colleagues share this, that's probably the group we're most concerned about from a job protection perspective because they also are likely to work in those jobs that don't have that job protection. So I think about those households, single-parent families, as the most vulnerable and also likely the ones that need this benefit the most. But I think this bill addresses that. We've talked about some of the problems with that, but they definitely cover those households.
And I guess the interesting thing would be here that the single mom is still able to go into the workplace and is not required to sort of take that time off.
Yeah.
Right?
In my view, both the benefits and the costs are magnified for single parents. They might need the money up front that much more. And again, if they believe because of the lack of job protection that they still have to go to work, the income to offset either child care is still better. But again, losing all those future benefits at a time when they likely will be just as vulnerable, that's a real cost for them, any way you set it up, I think.
Hi, Jane Adams again. I'm glad you were talking about this from a child tax credit perspective, that maybe it's a child tax credit policy instead of a parental leave policy, because I see a lot of holes in it as a parental leave policy. For example, you had twins. What do you do if you have multiple children? What if you have no wages and you're unemployed? How would you pull forward on that? I'm thinking of some of the most rural areas, specifically in Arizona, but also where I'm from in Alabama, where there's 1 or 2 daycare providers, and knowing this benefit is coming their way, what prevents daycares from just increasing their costs, and so it doesn't really become that much of a financial benefit to you. What if you're pregnant and unemployed? Can you pull that money forward, knowing that you might need that for prenatal care, all of those things? It's just, I see lots of holes in the parental aspect of it, but I do like the idea of what you were saying about comparing it with something like a young child tax credit or the Working Families Tax Relief Act. That's more of a comment, but kind of curious what else you all are seeing as far as some of those holes.
But Jane, in all fairness, if the parent is unemployed, they're not going to benefit from any of these state programs.
They might.
Well,
Right?
my sense was there's a certain.
The look-back period, if they're unemployed, it depends on the look-back in the
Okay,
state.
but
if
in
they've
many
got
cases,
earnings,
in many cases,
in many
it
cases they
will
wouldn't be.
not.
But the state programs, for people who aren't familiar with them, they're a social insurance-based model that's based on workforce attachment over a long look-back period. The look-back period varies, and it's more complicated than is worth getting into now or than I know off the top of my head. But it's not just like, are you employed at that given moment? And because they're administered through state systems that actually keep track of wages over time, as opposed to the IRS, they can actually look back at your earnings records over time and make sense of that in a way that the IRS just isn't actually equipped.
So there's no real workforce attachment condition in their bill except for the $2,500 for the refundable part of the credit, right?
Right.
I mean, and you
I mean,
don't.
the CTC has an earned income requirement, which is very minimal. I think it's like $1,500. So you have to show a little earning in order to
1,500,
claim.
not 25.
$2,500 is the refundable. It's the amount of the credit.
Oh, so it's lower
but
for
even
one
to
than the
claim,
other, interesting.
Yeah, even to claim the
Yeah.
CTC, there's a minimal earned
Yeah.
income
Okay.
requirement. Yeah.
Right, it's 3,000, so you have to have
3,000?
some earned
Yeah.
income. But that's for the taxable year, so you
Yeah.
don't know when that money
But
comes.
I
Which
think
also, I had a baby on December 30th, and so I've been trying to wrap my head around too, like exactly how would this work
Which
for
tax
that?
year?
Yeah, like which tax year and how much, or like would I actually have gotten like a lot? Because like, I mean, we got an extra year of child tax credit deduction. Like the labor and delivery nurses were very excited about this for me. So there's that question.
I think there are a lot of technical or administrative questions here, but I think your main point was that you liked Elizabeth's notion of framing this within the, and Aparna, you said this too, the child tax credit policy arena, and I like that as well. I think you should write an op-ed about this, Elizabeth. No, I think it's a very important idea.
Yeah,
Very
yeah.
important idea.
But it does raise the question then of crowd out.
Yeah.
This kind of benefit, for instance, crowd out, by the way, both by the employers already providing it, and that's a small number, but from the states doing these really state, if the states switch their benefit to last dollar, which they might be inclined to do in a period of tight budgets, then it's not just a tax issue, then it does become a child
It
care
does
issue.
become a child care
So all the existing state policies do have some dependence on how this is handled and how they choose to handle that. If they view this as a program with so many holes in it, for the people not working and for low-income people who don't have job protection, then they might not make their own programs last dollar because they might be too concerned that too many families won't benefit from this. But it is at least partially within the realm of, because of these issues, I think that the paid leave bucket of policies.
Can I just throw this out there, because I know we're not going to have time to fully discuss it, but I think that all the holes we're talking about, that's why I actually like the Social Security proposal that has been put out there. I like it a little bit better than this proposal because it addresses a lot of the holes we've mentioned, but the other is that we currently in this country, in terms of federal spending, spend more on older Americans than children, about 6-to-1, and even when you factor in state and local funding, it's 2-to-1. So we spend a lot more money on older Americans than we do children, and so the idea of taking a small pot of money already dedicated to children and just divvying it up more, as opposed to taking money targeting older Americans and moving that forward to children, I like that model actually better. And so again, I'll just throw throw that out there. We're not going to obviously have time to debate that policy.
Boy, I disagree with that. When you look at how many families have undersaved for their retirements, I just
should
don't
talk
think
to
this is-
Andy Biggs in this building.
I actually am going to be somewhat supportive of Angela and disagree with you, Harry.
Okay.
And one of the reasons is because of what you just said, Angela. I mean, there's no question that we spend a bundle on the elderly and not very much on children in this country. And we really need to redress that. But also because politically, I think if I was a Democrat, well, I sort of am, but but if I were a powerful Democrat in the Congress, I would say to myself, yes, enact the Rubio-type proposal, and by the time we get to 2040 or whatever it is, we will have figured out a way to cover those elderly people. We're not going to actually go through with it in the end.
I'm not sure that makes it a better policy, because if it just kicks the
Well,
can down the road
I
for a
admit it's
system
a
that already has a
political
lot
argument.
of finance. Anyway, I accept your point that it's not an obvious.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say I'm not sure that we have to just shift the money around. Like, there are other places where we could
We
potentially
could raise
money.
taxes.
raise
new money.
including, I mean, we can say that, wealth taxes or raising taxes on the very top could pay for like just about anything we could imagine. But there's a whole separate conversation,
That's
I
a
think,
whole
about
separate
where revenue could come from, and the fact that in addition to thinking about how we distribute what we spend across the life cycle, we should also think about how much we're actually spending and on whom across the income distribution
Well, I
as well.
think that's exactly right, and that's Harry's point about, the fact that we're stuck in this no new taxes fiscal world right now, and that's a little crazy.
Well, and there's been no pushback in any of the states that have paid leave programs that are funded through small additional payroll taxes, because the payroll tax addition is so small. And they're really, those states, obviously, as Harry said, I'll concede the point that they are mostly blue, but they have not blue people in them, right? Like, every state, even if it aggregates up to being represented by
Reds are just
Democrats in
suffering through
Congress,
it.
like, not everyone in California is like, driving a Tesla and eating green smoothies and like thrilled to pay as much in taxes as possible, right? Like, Kevin McCarthy is also from from California. The whole Central Valley is in California. There is diversity within states, and there is pretty universal support and minimal pushback around the financing mechanism that was in fact a small tax increase.
Okay, any final questions before we wrap up? Great, thank you so much to our panelists and to all of you for being here.
Yeah, thank you all.